I was planning on asking a hypothetical question to help us connect with this chapter in Genesis. The question was going to be something like, if you needed to sell something or give something up to make ends meet, what would you consider selling or what would you consider giving up? But as I thought about this question, I found myself thinking about the farming crisis in the 1980s. I wasn't around then, but I know enough about it to know that the question I was going to ask wasn't necessarily hypothetical. If I was planning to be hypothetical, it wasn't going to be. Nor would it be hypothetical even in my own life. I know what it's like to go without a meal or to pawn something off to make a little extra money to pay off a bill. And so as we go through this chapter, I encourage you to recall those situations and times to mind. We're going to see the same thing happen here. And we'll be able to connect, I think, with the people in this passage in a deeper way because of it. So how about this to help us to connect to this chapter in a different way? Have you ever had the opportunity to help your family? Maybe it was as simple as helping them move, or maybe you were a listening ear or a shoulder to cry on in a season of grief. Or maybe they were hurting financially and you gave them some money. Whatever it was, were you able to help them in a real and practical way? And maybe they were able to help you. I have a few times, mainly helping people move. A couple times by officiating funerals and other times by officiating weddings. But mainly it's helping in the little things, cleaning up after a graduation party or watching their kids or overall just finding ways to serve them. And you know, growing up, serving your family isn't really on your mind. You know, you're more concerned as you're growing up about standing out and being your own person, defining yourself and pursuing your own interests. And it takes maturity, and I really think a Christ-like maturity at that, to realize that God has placed us in a group of people that we can serve and that we can be the hands and feet of Christ to. Now, as Paul would say, I'm sure none of us are perfect in it, but I'm sure it's something that we're all striving for. And so when you boil this chapter down, those are the two main ways to think about it, albeit in reverse order, helping your family and knowing what it's like to sacrifice to survive. But while we won't see God mentioned anywhere in this chapter, we have to ask ourselves, where is God in this chapter? Where is he in the events of not only this chapter, but preparing them for what he's going to do in the midst of their future? So let's read through Genesis 47 and let's consider where God is. Starting in verse 1. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now, please, let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of my years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Pharaoh and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." And so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food. And we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." He answered, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. All right. Now remember from the last chapter that Joseph knew exactly what needed to be said and done in this initial situation. He knew the Egyptian culture, and he knew his own family's culture. So in Genesis 46, verses 31 to 34, Joseph coached his brothers on what to say when they met Pharaoh. But even if they said exactly the right words, everything still depended on Pharaoh. He could still change his mind, and his decision was final. I mean, up to this point now, Pharaoh had been very generous. He's invited Joseph's entire family to come and live in Egypt. He even sent wagons down to carry them up and bring their possessions, and even promised to replace anything that they may have left in the land of Canaan. But people in Pharaoh's position can change their minds. They can promise something but decide that they weren't going to follow through. And so Joseph doesn't want to presume upon Pharaoh. And I bet Joseph's also thinking about the perception of the people in Egypt. I mean, tell me, how would we react if we found out that Vice President Kamala Harris gave her family the best land in our country for them to live on, that they didn't have to pay anything? She gave them governmental assistance to move there and replace anything that they lost. And this would all happen during an economic downturn in our country. While everyone else is hurting, her family gets the red carpet rolled out and all their needs met. That's what's happening in this situation. Joseph is essentially the vice president. I mean, it's not like an exact one-to-one ratio, but he's in that position of second in command in the country. And this is what's going to be happening with his family. How do you think we would react? How do you think other people would react? So again, here's Joseph, Pharaoh's right-hand man, second in command, and this is what's about to happen. If he did everything that Pharaoh had suggested, he would have faced criticism at best. And so so for Joseph, it's wise to publicly confirm once more that this is Pharaoh's decision, not his own. and that what he originally suggested was what he's going to do, and thus show everyone that the settlement of Israel was Pharaoh's work. And it was also wise, I think at least it was a good political move, to settle his brothers and his family in Goshen first, and then tell Pharaoh about it. He can show that they all fit in the land for one, and that the work of settling them is already done. It would be actually more work to unsettle them and put them somewhere else. But I wonder if this is where the expression came from. It's better to ask forgiveness than for permission. I mean, it's not where the expression came from, but that seems to be what's operative here. And so that's what Joseph told Pharaoh. And then he presented his brothers. And what's the first thing Pharaoh asks in verse 3? What's your occupation? And this is exactly what Joseph said he would ask. In wisdom, a wisdom that comes from God, Joseph discerned what Pharaoh would say, and he prepared his brothers for it. And after they give him, the brothers give Pharaoh the answer that Joseph told them to give, they go on to volunteer a whole lot more. More than I think Joseph wanted to be volunteered. Maybe they were nervous, maybe they were excited, maybe they thought that they've just gotten this far by their honesty and they should just keep going with it. Whatever the reason, they moved beyond what Joseph told them to say. They volunteered that they were planning on sojourning in the land, meaning that this would be a temporary settlement. They volunteered that there was no pasture in the land of Canaan because of how severe the famine was. And then they asked to be settled in Goshen, which I think is funny, because they had just told Pharaoh that they were planning to sojourn in the land. Like, this is going to be temporary. Now they're asking to dwell in the land. And so they moved from answering a question to requesting land in Egypt from the most powerful person in the world. I think that takes some courage. But I also think it's just a little funny when you think about it, because back in Genesis 46, verse 34, when Joseph is giving instructions to his family, he says this. 46 verse 34. You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers. That's all Joseph wanted them to say. The quiet part was so that after you say that, you can dwell in the land of Goshen. That's the part that wasn't supposed to be spoken out loud. That was what was supposed to happen because of what they said. They weren't supposed to say it. It was supposed to be the result. And so I just kind of think it's funny. They didn't get the memo. I imagine Joseph's face here, his eyes are kind of getting wider as his brothers are sharing more and more information and trying to like catch their eyes and saying, stop. Stop talking. Hopefully don't get to the part where you say we're an abomination to the land of Egypt. Joseph is probably praying that they just at least stop before saying that to Pharaoh. But anyways, even though the brothers don't stick to the plan, Pharaoh's response is favorable. His first response in verse 5 is to summarize the situation. In today's language, it'd be saying something like, so I see your father and your brother has arrived. This is a way of welcoming them, and also I think just a touch of humor of how the brothers responded to his question. You know, kind of see just a little amusement in Pharaoh's voice towards the brothers giving too much information in response to a simple question. But from there, Pharaoh reiterates his promise, and he even expands on it a little bit. As far as he is concerned, they could settle wherever they wanted to. Now, the original Hebrew at the start of verse 6 says, the land of Egypt is before your face. And this means that all of the land lies before them and it is at their disposal. They could settle in the best part of the land. But then he specifically grants them Goshen, which could be the best part of the land, or it could be like saying you can go anywhere, but if Goshen is what you want, then so be it. Either way, they get what they wanted. And then Pharaoh goes a step further. What does he suggest at the end of verse 6? Yeah, if they know of any competent men that could take care of his flock, let him know. So I think Pharaoh's going just above and beyond to not only welcome this family, but to show just his trust and respect for this man who's helped them through this difficult time. And so Joseph brings his father Jacob before Pharaoh. It was an act of honor and respect to present the head of a family to the most powerful ruler. But what does Jacob do at the end of verse 7? He blesses him. Now I think this is important because it's common in the ancient world for the greater person to bless the lesser person. In fact, Hebrews 7:7 specifically says this. It says in reference to Melchizedek blessing Abraham, it says, "It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior." So for Jacob to bless Pharaoh here almost feels like a reversal of what we would expect to have happened. And it wasn't, I think, what Pharaoh expected either, because what does Pharaoh ask Jacob in verse 8? Yeah, how old are you? I think this is how Pharaoh is wrapping his mind around being blessed by a shepherd. Remember, shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. And so not only would he be surprised by someone else blessing him, but being blessed by a shepherd. In status, in authority, in wealth, and in power, it seemed like Jacob was lesser than Pharaoh. But until almost very recently in human history, the older person, the age of a person, the greater honor was bestowed upon them. And so if Jacob was older, then Pharaoh would have no reason to get upset. And how old is Jacob at this point? 130 years. 130 years old. Can you imagine living 130 years old? I should have asked that question when we were back in the beginning of Genesis. Can you imagine living 967 years old? 130 years old. And he describes his life as a pilgrimage and views it as practically finished. In retrospect, Jacob compares his life with his dad and his grandpa and knows that it won't last as long as theirs. He says that my days aren't going to be as long as my father's. And he says that his days have been few and evil. This word evil comes from a Hebrew word meaning evil, darkness, and wretched. Now for us, we might say, well, he just reunited with Joseph. Wouldn't he just be over the moon right now? But if you look back on his life, Jacob's probably remembering how he had to flee from his home, how he was deceived by Laban and had to work years and years of servitude to him, how he was in constant hostility and tension with his brother, how he grieved the rape of his daughter and by the slaughter perpetuated by his sons. He's probably troubled by Reuben's incest and grieved to the point of death by the loss of Rachel, Joseph, and possibly Benjamin when he let him go. So Jacob has been through quite a few things. Difficult things, huh? That's an understatement. Yeah. And some of that he caused himself, and some of it was done to him, for sure. Yep. Exactly. Gracia said he tricked, but he was tricked as well. So anyways, he describes his days as few, evil, and about done. And then he blessed Pharaoh again, and he leaves. Then Joseph made the Goshen settlement permanent. No longer were they settled there. Verse 11 says that he gave them possession of the land. Possession is a more permanent foothold in Egypt than they had even in Canaan. And he provided them with food, enough to feed everyone. And then we switch away from Joseph and his family, and we look at the broad nation of Egypt in general. The contrast is made pretty clear in verses 12 and 13. Joseph provided for his entire family with food in verse 12, but in verse 13 there was no food in the land. While all the Israelites had all their needs provided for, the rest of the land was still dealing with the effects of the famine. And we're told that the famine was very severe and that the land languished or was exhausted or wasted away or fainted from the Hebrew, and even depending on your translation. And according to verse 14, what was the first thing used to counter the effects of the famine? Money, right? And that's pretty natural, isn't it? People spend money on food. But then all the money is used up, and so the Egyptians come to Joseph, and in their interaction with him over the next few verses, we won't see, well, do we see any fighting? Do we see any accusations? Any name-calling? It seems like they genuinely trust Joseph and that they have confidence in him for whatever his plan will be. And so they present their problem to Joseph. They want food and they have no money. Thankfully, Joseph has a workable plan. What would they give? What can they give for their food? Their livestock first. Yep, livestock. They had to be, I think that had to be kind of a relief for the people, to not have to care for their cattle even during that difficult time. I don't know. The fact that the people brought their livestock to him shows kind of how dire their need was. I mean, that's basically their livelihood. But the result was that they had food for an entire year. And the people didn't lose their self-respect. They were paying for what they received. And after that year, they come back again. But this time, instead of asking for food for nothing, they put forward two resources for the food. One was what Jolene just said, the land, and the other one was themselves. In other words, they're willing to become slaves and to give up all that they own so that they can survive. I think they're learning a little lesson from Joseph's approach to the situation. Rather than having outright donations, he doesn't allow outright donations in his relief efforts, so they figure that the next step is to sell themselves and their lands. And for them, probably the price isn't too high because the thing that's at stake is their very lives. And so how does Joseph respond in verses 20 and 21? Buys all the land. Everyone is put into servitude. But notice in verse 20 that he was very clear on who he was buying this land for. It was for Pharaoh. Joseph is being, I think, again, very wise here. Both Pharaoh and the people could trust him more as he operated with complete integrity. And this is how all the land became Pharaoh's and all the people became his servants. It says from one end of Egypt to the other at the end of verse 21. And who's the exception to the rule? The priests. Their land was not bought. Maybe this was because of the great respect they enjoyed, because of their strong influence in the nation. Either way, they kept their land and their personal freedom, and they were given special allowance by Pharaoh to live on. And then Joseph addresses the people. He tells them very plainly that he is not profiting at all from this transaction, that this is all going to Pharaoh. But in return, he immediately gives them the seed that they're bargaining for, and he defines for them what their obligations will be in the future. How much of their harvest do they have to give to Pharaoh? A fifth, 20%. That's a 20% tax rate. And they get to keep 4/5 and use it however they'd like. So the Egyptians, for their part, understand Joseph's motives and appreciate that what he actually did for them. And they admit it in verse 25. They say, "You have saved our lives." The whole thing is published as an ordinance that continues to Moses' day, which is 400 some years later. That'd be like for us if the Mayflower Compact was still legally binding on us today, about 400 years. So the famine in Joseph's day had a lasting impact in Egyptian society. Generations of people lived with the consequences of what happened during it. In the meantime, Israel settled in the land of Egypt, and they were fruitful and they multiplied. How long did Jacob live in Egypt? 17 years. 17 years. So even though he may have thought his life was over, he still had quite a few years left for him. And I think this is a act of God, like a grace of God on his part, giving Jacob and Joseph time to reconnect after being gone for so long. So he asks Joseph to put his hand. Oh, sorry, let me go back. He lives 147 years when it becomes apparent that the end is inevitable. Jacob felt it necessary to talk to Joseph one last time. He had a special request to make, so he has him put his hand under his thigh. This is the same request that Abraham gave to his servant when he wanted him to go find a wife for his son Isaac back in Genesis 24. And so the request he makes of Joseph is one of faith, I think, in God's promises. Jacob believed God's promises in reference to Israel, the land of Canaan, and the blessing of all the nations of the world through Abraham's seed. His deepest hopes were tied to the covenant that God had made with his fathers and his forefathers. Israel? I don't think Israel had to ever give any of their... No, because it doesn't say that. It just says the Egyptians had to do that. Yeah, it would have. And that's probably what eventually led to Exodus. That they were so fruitful and multiplying, and it says in the first chapter of Exodus, that they had so many possessions and stuff. Yeah, they became quite despised eventually because of that. Yeah, their livestock could have been part of the food that they gave, yeah. And honestly, with the famine being so severe, who knows how much of their livestock was surviving at that, So yeah, Jacob asks Joseph to bring him to the land of Canaan. The only suitable land that his family owned at the time was the cave at Machpelah, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were buried. We'll find that out in a couple of chapters here. And so he requested to be laid to rest there. And Joseph agrees to do this, and he swears his assurance. The last sentence in verse 31 has an important Hebrew word in it. The word bowed comes from a Hebrew word meaning to bow down in reverence. This gives us the indication that Jacob bowed his head in prayer or in worship. He wasn't kind of bowing his head because he was tired or close to death. It's more of he was bowing his head in worship to God, thanking him that his last request would be taken care of. So as we come to the close of this chapter, we see again that God wasn't mentioned anywhere in it. We don't see any mention of his name, even title, even Lord of Hosts or Lord Almighty or anything like that. And yet, look what he has done in this situation. I'm going to put up some things that God has done throughout this chapter. First, he provides for his covenant people. In the midst of the famine, his people are given the best land and given enough food for everyone. When the Egyptians had to sell everything, including themselves, to survive, the Israelites were provided for. So the first thing we see God do here is that God provides. Second, God protected both the Israelites and Joseph, hopefully, from any charge of favoritism at the time. Like we just talked about, by the time we get to Exodus, feelings towards them change. But the way the situation played out was, at least in the moment, accepted by everyone. Not once did we see the people accuse Joseph of anything. It doesn't point fingers at his family or anyone else. All the wisdom that Joseph needed, all the actions and words that needed to be said and done, were guided by God's hands. And so God protects. Third, it was for this moment that God sent Joseph to Egypt. If you have a second, turn over to Psalm 105. Psalm 105, specifically, we're going to look at just verses 16 and 17. But look at Psalm 105 for a moment. I'm going to start in verse 12. When they were few in number, of little account, and sojourners in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. Verse 16. When he summoned a famine on the land, and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, his neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. Then Israel came to Egypt. Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And it goes on. See, it was for this moment that God sent Joseph to Egypt. God sent Joseph ahead of his family specifically to provide for them, to watch over them, so that God could protect them. And so even though we don't see it being talked about in Genesis 47, God prepared, I'm going to just say prepares, but God prepared for their arrival through sending Joseph there decades earlier. And lastly, God granted another 17 years to Jacob in this land. 17 years of being reunited with Joseph. He didn't die during the famine. The famine had passed by at least a decade before Jacob passed away. And so in his last years, they were spent with his family and in relative peace. God restores. I'm going to put it over here so you can see it. And then you don't have to bend down and write it. God restores and God sustains. That's 5 important lessons that we can see connected or coming out of this chapter. God provides, God protects, God prepares, God reunites or restores, and God sustains. So be encouraged as you go through the Bible to find out how God is working and moving in the situation, especially in chapters like this where maybe it's not as obvious. Doing this, I think, will help us to see God's work even in our own lives. Any other questions, comments, or insights to this chapter? All right. That's all for tonight. Next week, I will be still coming back from the triennial, so there won't be any Discipleship U. And then I think we're back, and then I think we're back together the week after. So just keep that in your minds. All right. Have a good night. Thanks for coming.